Shalom, my name is Tony Robinson of Restoration of Torah Ministries, and we're going to continue our teaching, our presentations on chiastic structures entitled Chiastic Revelations. And in today's lesson, we're going to look at the chiastic structure of Genesis chapter 28, verse 10 through 32, verse 3. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at this chiastic structure. We're going to see how it's arranged. And remember, chiastic structures are simply thematic patterns, thematic ways of telling stories where all of the themes in the first half will be repeated in the second half in reverse order. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start off with Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 through 12. And this is the story of how Jacob had to leave the promised land because of Esau. And so I call that the general theme there is his exile from the promised land. It is thematically connected to Genesis chapter 32 verses 1 through 3, which is when Jacob returned to the promised land. Now I want to give you a few specific thematic connections between these two passages. In Genesis chapter 28, verse 6, it says, "Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, 'Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it.'" And he goes on to name the place Bethel. But what I want you to do is I want you to notice how he said, "Surely the Lord." He said something about the place. He made what is the word I'm looking for? He noticed something about the place, and then he called the place. Well, if you go to Genesis chapter 32, verses 1 through 3, it says, when in verse 2, when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp." In other words, he makes an observation. That was the word I was looking for. He made an observation about the place, and then it says, and he called the name of the place Machanaim. So in both of these two passages, in chapter 28 and 32, Jacob makes an observation about where he is, and then he names the place something. Another thematic connection between these two passages is the fact that angels of God appear to Jacob in both. You'll remember that in Genesis chapter 28, when he left, that the angels appeared ascending and descending upon a ladder. Well, in Genesis chapter 32, in verse 1, it says, Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. So those are just those are two of the thematic connections that connect this verse in chapter 28 with in chapter 32. The next thematic connection that we want to look at is Genesis chapter 28, verses 13 through 22. And it talks about a pillar, a reminder of the Holy One's faithfulness. And if you remember, when Jacob left, he made an agreement, or like a covenant, an agreement with Adonai, and he erected a pillar which was supposed to be a reminder. Remember, he said, if you take care of me and bring me back, then I'm going to build a house of God, etc. And so he erected a pillar as a reminder of the faithfulness. Well, remember, Jacob fled from Laban, his uncle Laban, and in Genesis 31, verses 43 through 55, Jacob and Laban, or Laban in Hebrew, they erected a pillar as a reminder of their agreement. That they would not be aggressive towards one another. So that is the second thematic connection, the second major theme of this passage. Now we move to Genesis chapter 29, verses 1 through 35, and this is how Jacob worked for Rachel and Leah. It's a description of the 7 years that he worked, and he received Leah, and then he worked another 7 years for Rachel. Well, this is thematically connected in the second half of this chiastic structure to Genesis chapter 31, verses 1 through 42. You'll remember that when Laban caught up with Jacob, that Jacob finally stood up on his feet, and he began to rebuke Laban. And so in this passage, Jacob is recounting the suffering and labor that he had under Laban. In other words, in Genesis 31, 1 through 42, he's recounting all of the hard work that he did, whereas in Genesis 29, 1 through 35, it is actually a passage describing the work that he did. And that takes us to Genesis chapter 30, verses 1 through 21. And this is the story about how Jacob proliferated abundantly. You remember that when he first made it to Padam Aram, there was just him. And a few verses later, all of a sudden, he has an abundance of children. Well, this is thematically connected to Genesis chapter 30, verse 25 through 43, which describes how Jacob's flocks proliferated abundantly. And again, the common theme there is reproduction. And then that's going to lead us to the central axis, which is Genesis 30, verses 22 through 26. And it's the story of the birth of Joseph. Now, in the first lesson, we learned that that these many chiastic structures that they have central axes, and I want to talk to you about the two ways that the central axis functions in the next two lessons. But we're going to cover one way now. This chiastic structure is an example of how the chiastic structure is the focal point or the main point of the story. It's Adonai's way of thematically highlighting a takeaway from the story. In other words, the birth of Joseph is extremely important, and Adonai highlights this by making it the central axis of a chiastic structure. So there are many times when you find the central axis of a chiastic structure, you have actually found Adonai's highlight that this is important. Both Judaism and Christianity recognize that Joseph is a major messianic figure. And this right here, by making him his birth the central axis of a chiastic structure, is Adonai's way of saying, hey, watch this child, he's very important. Okay, so what else can we learn? We've already seen how chiastic structures occur throughout the Tanakh and the New Testament writings. They're simply everywhere. The other thing is that we just found out that Genesis 28 through 32 is told in a thematic pattern. Okay, and once we study thematically, we will be able to see these patterns. Now, what you may not have known is that Genesis chapter 28, 10 through 32, 3 is actually a Torah portion. It is the Torah portion called Vayetze. And many of you read the weekly Torah portions, and it is actually the Torah portion Vayetze. Now, let me talk to you about these Torah portions. No one knows who developed the Torah portions. Most Jewish scholars believe that they were probably developed a few hundred years before the first century, maybe the third or fourth century or so, but no one knows for sure. However, one thing that we can say for sure is that the rabbis who developed the Torah portions used thematic analysis as I'm teaching you now. They studied the scriptures thematically, they saw the themes, and they made thematic connections. These wise rabbis of those early centuries, they did this. We know it beyond a shadow of a doubt, and the reason why we know that this is true is because many of the Torah portions themselves are chiastic structures, such as this one here, Vayetze. Shemot is another chiastic structure. Shalach is a chiastic structure. And so we know that they studied the scriptures thematically, that they knew how to make thematic connections, and that they saw these patterns because many of the Torah portions are based on these chiastic structures that they found. So we're going to leave you with that. And I hope that this has been a blessing to you, and we'll continue to learn about chiastic structures on our journey. And may Adonai bless you tremendously. Hallelujah.